Good afternoon, everybody. So here's Nathan Woodrow to talk about QGIS. Take it away.
Thanks. So yeah, I'm Nathan Woodrow. I've been a QGIS developer for since 2011, so I'll just give you that context now so I don't have to do an About Me slide. So if you're not familiar with what is QGIS anyway, well, it's a GIS package, open source GIS package. If you're also not familiar with what GIS is, then it's one of these. A geographic information system, which is essentially spatial data. This is pretty much a mandatory slide from uni stuff. It's for analyzing spatial data and reporting and asking questions about spatial data. If you're like me, I used to use GIS in a council context, like a local government council context. So I used it to maintain water mains and sewer mains and road networks and stuff like that. You can also use it to make pretty maps like this about the Cambodia rice paddocks. This is a map made purely out of what QGIS can actually generate. You can also use it, people also use it for generating maps for publications. Also made by one of the developers on QGIS. So it sits on top of other major open source projects. It doesn't just live off in its own right. So part of the reason I came to talk here is just because it shows the large open source GIS community. It's a bit like the Linux community. It's got a lot of breadth. It sits on top of some other major projects. One's called GDAL, which is an open source written in C, C++, data transformation library, I guess. You can open a range of different data formats with it. And then we use GDAL so we can open all those different formats that you can poke a stick at. Proj is another C library for doing coordinate projections. Coordinate projections is not something you want to do yourself because it's hairy and there's a lot of maths in that, so we just let it do it. And Python and Qt. So we also use Perl and other frameworks, standard sort of open source stack. But this talk's not necessarily about that stuff. We'll come back to that, but we'll just go back to the start and how it created, because we're going to talk about how we got to where we are now. It definitely didn't start like this. So in 2002, Gary Sherman created Quantum GIS. It used to be called Quantum GIS and not QGIS. We abbreviated later. You'll see what the rebranding step. He was ex-Esri, and if you're in spatial, Esri is another a large proprietary company. They dominate most of the market. He worked for them. He moved across, had Unix and Linux systems, and so created Quantum GIS so he could use it on Linux because they used to run on Windows only, and they killed their Unix branches. So I went back and checked out the first revision just to see what it looked like, because it doesn't look like this now at all. It's pretty minimalistic. There's a nice little README, and it doesn't look like this now. It's quite large. And the build steps, which on Linux is probably about the same, because you check it out, make, done. On Windows, it's not as easy as that, unfortunately. But it didn't really do much except for view PostGIS data. So if you've used PostGIS before, it's a spatial extension for Postgres, but that's basically all it did. So there's 2,745 lines of code in that C++ file. It basically just listed PostGIS tables, and that's about it. It didn't do much else. And if you haven't checked out PostGIS, you definitely really should, because it's a great starting platform for this kind of stuff, for spatial analysis. To start as a hobby project, he just started it because he needed something on Unix and Linux to actually be able to view PostGIS data, because there was nothing else. So he created that, and then kind of got some releases, and you got this cute dog splash screen and a cute cat splash screen, and then eventually they released like a version 1-ish, and they started naming it after planets and moons. But it's quite amateurish at the time, like standard hobby project, you don't have to worry about too much. But it did grow quite rapidly, considering it's only 2002, and it's not that old really. This is the Google Trends history for it, and you can see there's a first Windows release back there, and the formation of the project steering committee, and eventually the trends just grew up. This only goes to 2017. I didn't generate further than that because it's not my graphic that I stole. But you can also see the commits also increased quite rapidly, and also the core contributors. So a few people came on to the core group, and then eventually it sort of exploded, and we had a lot more contributions. There's also some mailing a list activity that I generated before this talk with my really hacky Python skill, generated to pull the mailing list activity and just visualize it over time. And you'll notice there's a really steep increase, and it kind of peters off, but we'll see why that later on. But there's a lot of, from 2007 onwards, the traffic increased quite rapidly and grew the project. So that's mailing lists for dev, the community mailing list, which is still quite low, but then there's users mailing list as well. So users and dev kind of matched. Generally, if you're a user, you probably eventually transitioned into a dev as well. So the other thing there is dev increased, but then also decreased after, and that was because we transitioned to GitHub. So a lot of discussion moved from mailing list onto GitHub. This is just pull requests that have been open, so it's not quite a translation of discussion, but I got rate limited on GitLab API to actually get all the comments out. But you can see that most of the discussion is now on GitHub, so that the mailing list has gone down, but activity has increased. We have a lot more discussion than we used to have. So where are we actually at now? We're at, from version 003, which is the first proper actual release, we're at QGIS 3.10. The splash screens have got a little bit prettier, well, probably a lot more prettier. They look a lot more professional. We name our releases after where we host our developer meetings. So when we host a developer meeting, that's their kind of, they get the naming for the release for the next 6 months to the next release, or 4 months to the next release. It's also turned into one of the biggest open source cross-platform being the key there, because there are other open source GIS packages, but the cross-platform ability of them is not as much, whereas we cover all the operating systems. It's also part of the open source Geospatial Foundation, which is a bit like the Linux Foundation. It's a parent organization that, or parent foundation that we can ask for money and ask for help and guidance and things like that. There's a whole host of other projects that are part of that, and QGIS got incubated into that very early on. So that helped us grow as well, because then it's part of that. And a lot of our users and devs also use other software as part of that, because we're sort of a family, I guess. It's just definitely no longer just a PostGIS viewer. We can open pretty much every spatial format you can poke a stick at. Even just a CSV, you can just drop it in there and it will visualize the CSV with X and Ys. So it's definitely grown to visualize more data than Gary had ever intended to do. And I should actually probably say that QGIS supported GDAL very early on, so it could open those formats from a very early age, which probably gave it a bit of a heads up over some of the other projects that tried to implement their own drivers for different formats, because there are some really nasty formats out there and you don't want to be doing it yourself. It's also got a humongous community. I'd probably say one of the bigger ones, at least in the open source spatial world. It's also quite friendly compared to some other projects. We try to at least be a lot more conscious of what we discuss and involve more people. Also got plugin infrastructure, so that also grows that extended community more, rather than just being users and devs. It's now users and devs and also plugin authors, which are not quite the same. There's a little bit of intersection there. And it also brings problems, which I'll discuss later. And more frequent stable release cycles and all the fancy things that go with software once you get into this game, like unit tests and automated builds and packages and all that kind of fun stuff. It's also definitely not 2,000 lines of code anymore. Just in C++ alone, it's almost 1 million. And lots of Python, which is getting converted into C++ for various reasons. Also XML, but that's UI files, so I guess you don't really count that because we don't write that manually. But there's also Perl and C for some stuff. Some of our libraries are just pure C, and we pull them in directly and modify them directly. So all our dependencies are also C, so it's kind of in this as well. So it's pretty large code base. So it definitely means we're not really in the comfortable place that we used to be. Given that it's grown so large, all that stuff that we've brought into the project comes at a bigger cost than what it used to come at. So they're not negative stuff, like all that's good stuff. We have to have automated testing, we have to have packages and better code stability and stuff like that, but it definitely does add a cost to the project that we didn't have before. one of those costs is definitely code takes a lot longer to make changes for. One of them is purely from a stability point of view, not breaking APIs point of view, being aware that your change may look small to you, but then has this massive knock-on effect, a bit like kind of like Linux kernel kind of effect at times once you've got plugin authors using that code. So maybe not as big as Linux kernel, obviously, but still. You've also got documentation, doesn't write itself. There was no documentation back in the day, or when you did, it was only like 5 features. Now it's, I don't even know how many features there is. Plus all the different use cases that people have, trying to cover those and make sure they actually are documented well. A bigger barrier to entry for any new people coming to the project, whether that's users from a usability point of view or also from a dev point of view. And the project's also using a mix of funding and volunteer work. Most of my work was volunteer, pretty much has been volunteer most of my life, but there's people who just do pure funding work and they don't volunteer at all. So this talk is primarily about some of the growing pains that we had, because you don't get a project that large without hitting some of these issues. The first issue we're going to run into is installers. This is not the first issue in the project, this is just one I picked out, because it's an obvious one to talk about. So installers are, you definitely need them for your project, because you just can't do that anymore. You can't just dump a source dump out and then try and install a tar biz anyway. Like, you can't. Users just won't do it. We're not running, most users don't run Linux for a start. Most of our users don't run Linux. So you have to have Windows packages, and you have to have OS X packages, and then Linux packages. And even if you do Linux packages, there's 5 different major distros that you want to support, or at least 2 or 3 of the major ones. But even that's problematic. So they should be easy, relatively easy to make and install a package, whack it in a thing and distribute it done right, but it's not really. Like, it's pretty freaking hard. The amount of work that goes into packaging, just the Windows stuff alone is really hairy. All the dependencies that we have and how they're packaged up. They've got extra files that you have to bundle with them, and if they're not bundled right, they won't work. And then there can be subtle bugs if you don't package certain things right. Proj will still work, but it might not do the transformation correctly because you're missing the transformation files. And sometimes it will tell you, and sometimes it won't. It will tell you in the log, but that's not useful to a user because they won't know to look there. So it's quite hard, and given that we depend on those package maintainers to actually have a usable product, it's a bit of a stretch to ask them to do more and more. So I always tell people to be nice to the package maintainers. This also comes down to a problem that we had was communication breakdowns. We had a Twitter discussion around the OS X installer, and the OS X installer was pretty, I'm not going to say poor, that's an insult to the guy who wrote it, but it didn't run on newer stuff well. And so there was a few issues with it. So there was an initiative to create a new one. It was created, put aside, but never published. And then a user came and said, well, your OS X installers are junk, you should be ashamed. But it turns out we just hadn't communicated that the fact that we just made new packages and they were ready to go, but no one had made the call to switch it. So we had to communicate better that we'd done the work, that users weren't aware that we'd done the work. So some other growing pains that we had was breaking changes. Now, obviously, you definitely want to avoid breaking changes if you can, because good software doesn't break other people's software just for fun. But unfortunately, sometimes you definitely have to do it. One of these cases was the fact that Qt4 had been end-of-lifed for quite a long time whilst we were still using it, and then the distros started dropping it. Distros that we had no way of packaging it up to actually, like Windows is fine, we can just bundle it up and send it to users, but certain other distros, and especially OS X, it just didn't work, function properly. There was lots of bugs in the Qt code that would actually directly impact us, and it caused a lot of issues. So we had to make a call to drop it, move to Qt5, but that also brought Python 3, that's more breaking changes. And then PyQt also breaks those changes, breaks changes there. And then QGIS 3 itself, we decided to clean up the API and remove a lot of stuff that had built up over the years, but then that's more breaking changes. So this event was quite painful for a lot of people in terms of plugin authors that had plugins that had written back in the early days of QGIS 2 and hung it around for a long, long time, and then we just went and break all the APIs. So we did communicate, but it's communicating API changes to a user base that you don't control. There's no subscription, there's no license. You can't send everyone an email and say, we're going to break your API. We just put it on the mailing list and hope people actually see it and communicate it via Twitter and things like that. So we didn't like doing it, but unfortunately we got sort of forced to do it again. And then there's Qt6 coming up in the future, and we're trying to think how we can transition without breaking yet more APIs, because we don't want to do that. It definitely was for the better. Qt5 and Python 3 and all that stuff is heaps better. More compatibility with OS X and more compatibility with Windows. New features that we utilized instantly as soon as we broke those APIs and added new features, but at the same time it hurt a lot of people. It hurt even my stuff, and I was close to the project, and I still only haven't transitioned a lot of my stuff because it's just too much work. It's not hard to do, it just takes time. So people just give up, and a lot of the plugins dropped off, and then eventually they've sort of built up. And we saw this increase of plugins as people started to get comfortable with the API and help each other port them up. The other growing pain we got is documentation. So large projects obviously need documentation, API, as well as user documentation and potentially tutorials, and that's not necessarily like a user guide, but more just how to work through an example. We've always had them, but keeping them at pace is really, really hard for us, purely just because of the pace of change in the code base and the features that come in and the number of UI changes that sometimes happen, and applications like a command line tool, it's quite easy to document the API, like the user interface for that, command line switches and stuff like that, but with a UI, subtle changes, change the screenshot, and then the users get lost if the screenshot doesn't quite match up with what they're seeing. And differences between QGIS 3.2 and 3.10 might have moved stuff around, added new panels, added new steps. The buttons might change the location slightly, but that all messes up the documentation. So keeping on top of documentation and keeping that pace is a pain point for us, and it's still a pain point. Some of it's technical and some of it is discipline. Developers not being disciplined enough to do documentation at the time, but then also the friction is also quite high with documentation. Anyway, even if you like doing it, it's quite high. So the project has always tried to focus on stability. Maybe not in the early days, but after that break, it was definitely a critical element for us to focus on stability. So because lots of people rely on us for even sort of critical stuff, if you're doing maps for journalism or for academia or whatever, that kind of stuff, you kind of has to be right, and so you can't just go willy-nilly breaking stuff, changing things here and there between releases, majorly moving something from one place and putting it in another place because it's disruptive to the user. So we have to kind of focus on the stability a bit more than we used to, and that slows things down, increases the rate of change, in a good way, but it's still a problem you have to deal with. So we've also found that predictability through all that is what came out of this. People wanted predictability on the project and not just sporadic changes here or wherever we want. So we used to be able to cut releases whenever, and they just go out the door, and you might get a version today and then one for tomorrow. Like, you don't know when it's going to happen. It was just at the release at the whim of the release manager to decide, let's just cut a release now. And then it would be like this big frantic, oh, we're not ready, we don't have time, I haven't got the feature ready, I don't have time to fix it, you have to wait until after Christmas. And then we're like, okay, we'll do an exception, and then we'll do a release 2 months after that, and it was just bad. So the focus on predictability made it more stable for people could know what was coming out. They knew they were going to get a version. We could fix in those brackets, like good software practice, right? So that's when we transitioned from a hobby project doing whatever we wanted to an actual planned event that's going to happen tomorrow, and we have to make sure those patches are in there for tomorrow. They're not going to go out the door. Support is also part of that. We have support for the support providers. They're independent companies. A lot of them are developers on the project, but they provide support for the project. So if they don't know when things are going to change, and we just sporadically throw things over the wall at them, then they're not in a good place because they can't provide the support for the users. So we have an LTR system for the long-term releases, so that way most support providers will just support that for the next 6 months or 12 months or 2 years or whatever we hold the LTR for. And that way, at least they know what they're getting. But that also requires backporting, and that brings its own problems. But that's also, we have a website just to show what support providers there are, because there's the standard myth around the open source stuff, that there's no support and you're on your own, which is not the case. So we clearly communicate who the support providers are. And it's not just users that it's good for, stability is also good for the devs and testers and all that kind of stuff. If I can go in there and know it's going to be stable to change this and not suddenly break everything, it's just better for me generally as a dev anyway. So part of the project maturing is forming a sort of governance. Previously there was just release manager and just developers, and we just all make a call on when we cut the releases out, and didn't have a way to really do formal decision making. It was just go mail lists. Let's just do this. Yeah, cool. That's done. Let's go. Which works quite well at an early stage, but doesn't work well when you've got lots of developers and lots of users, and potentially decisions like breaking changes. When do you make them, and how do you do them, and how do you communicate that? And does the translators need to be involved in this process, or is it going to hurt some ex-user if we go and do this big major change? So there's a PSC established. Like most projects, eventually get a PSC. That was established quite early on. There's only a few people on that, and eventually the roles have expanded out to have more and more people on the PSC just to make decisions about certain things, like the release manager. We also established a board as well and a chair to make those final calls on those hard decisions. Things like where do we host things, and if there's tension around certain decisions, the chair and the board can make the decision to veto those decisions or whatever. And then we also have community voting members that vote the board in. So the board will rotate out. Every yearly elections elect a whole new board and a whole new PSC if people want to step down. So it's establishing that leadership context, concept in the project, so that if you have a problem, you know who to go to. And if you have a problem, a decision that the PSC needs to be involved in, just hit them. You don't throw it to the mailing list and hope that someone sees it because no one's monitoring it for the weekend. The PSC makes those critical decisions for us. Part of that whole growing up was rebranding as well. And that also came after the board and things like that, because that's a decision that they're involved in making. That's the original icon. Well, the original icon was the one you saw in our first few slides with that little tiny blue little planet, I guess. And then now it turned into the top left one, and then the top right one was the revision of that, and then eventually we rebranded into this bottom one. So we decided to do a rebranding around the 3 release just to have a bit more of a push to make people migrate, because 2 had been out for a long time, and if we don't sort of push people to migrate, they'll just sit on it, especially organisations who just decide that we're just not going to change because it's too risky. So the rebranding kind of gives us a bit of a refresh the website, refresh all the swag and things like that. So we also had to have a way to take money in, because projects definitely need money to sustain for long term. It's easy in the early days. We didn't really need much money. Infrastructure was just a server that hosted the builds, and that's about it. And we didn't really have any other expenses or much expenses. As the project's growing, obviously documentation and bug fixing and all those kinds of things, even hosting costs that go up, things like that. You still need money. Otherwise, you can't pay people to do work for you if you need money, if you need to do work. So we take donations. We also used to have a thing called sponsorship, but we killed that off and called it sustaining members, because it's hard to get companies to actually do sponsorships. From a bookkeeping point of view, they just don't do it. I don't know about here in Australia so much, but it came out of some of the European countries that just don't really like the word sponsorship on the books. So we have a sustaining members. It's basically the same kind of thing. There's a few other perks to it, but you get a logo and stuff like that on the website. But it's basically sponsorship, right? But it just looks a bit nicer. So as part of that, we get, it should be renamed, but quite a substantial amount of money. This is 2018 income. Quite a substantial amount of money in sponsorship money, or sustaining membership money, and which is really good for the project. And we also get money from selling training certificates. So if you're a training provider, you can do a certificate, like an official QGIS training certificate that has to be like vetted that your training is actually legitimate and not sort of saying you're doing training and you're not. So that actually makes some money. There's also funding drives and swag and all that kind of stuff that we did. So we also have a lot of outgoing. So 2018 outgoing was quite substantial, and most of the money gets spent into bug fixing. So QGIS itself sponsors its own bug fixing rounds. So we take the money that we get from sponsorship, which is the clear indicator on the website that if you sponsor us, it'll be used for probably bug fixing and paying for those, keeping the lights on in the hosting facility. But bug fixing is quite a substantial amount of money, and we spend it on making sure that the project is stable, because otherwise we can't have stability with bug fixing. In the past, we didn't do this, and it led to a lot of stuff just dropping and then people just walking away from it because they didn't have the time to then spend fixing the bugs. The employer just wanted the feature, and bugs would come up 6 months later and they didn't have time to fix it. So some of the core developers actually get paid. Yep.
Could you go into a little bit of detail about how that actually...
Yep, next one. Yeah, next couple of slides. So expected income for this year, roughly, this is going to change, obviously, because this is the end of 2019, but I didn't actually check the budget when I wrote these slides. So that's how much income that we were expected to get when I originally wrote this slide, because we haven't got a 2020 budget yet. But there's a substantial amount that goes out to bug fixing. It also goes out to bug fixing our dependencies as well. So that money is also flowing down upstream, I guess, to GDAL and Proj and any of the other dependencies. We also have upstream bugs fixing for Qt itself. Qt itself is actually run by a company. It's changed hands now, I think, but a major company maintains it, but they'll still take bug fixing from the community. So we had issues in QGIS that were Qt bugs, so we took those issues, hired a contractor, and then got them to fix those bugs because we don't have the contacts in that community. So we've got a bridge between us and the Qt and the company to get bug fixes upstream for us. And we also spent money on packaging, which is the OSX packaging, because it was a pain point in the community. We actually needed to spend money on it as a project to get it across the line, because we discussed that it was too much for someone to volunteer their time to do. So we funded some work for it, basically, for the best for the project. There's a lot of OSX users. It was increasing. And we don't really have a number of users because we don't obviously track licenses, so it's hard to know who's using what. But the OSX community with QGIS is definitely increasing, and the worst thing we wanted to do was just leave them on their own and say, well, just switch your OS, because that's not gonna work. So paying for the packaging definitely helped jump that gap and give them a better experience. But we'll just talk about money a little bit more, because it's always the root of all evil problem with money. There's volunteering and paid work. At what point do you say, I need to get paid for this, versus I'm just going to volunteer to fix stuff? Like I said, most of my stuff was volunteer-based, but at the same time, I had a stable job and didn't have to worry about have money for food. If you don't, you have to get paid, and there's a bit of tension around, well, they're getting paid for that, but I'm not. So at what point do I say, I want to get paid for bug fixing? And that's part of this next topic that I'll bring up. But it just definitely has a bit of a tension point in the community about who should get paid for things versus who should just volunteer time. Obviously, if you're volunteering, that's your choice to make. But if I sacrifice an hour of my life to fix a bug, then that's my choice. But I also have the capability of asking for it. So grant projects is part of this bug fixing thing. We have a grant project system where we go out to people and ask them to propose what features they would like and whether they can actually develop themselves and how much it's going to cost, and we vote. The board and all the community members vote on what we've put funding into. Some of that could be simple stuff, like we're just going to do a quick bug fix run through all this code, or it could be we're going to rip out the entire layout window, the layout logic, and replace it because it was poorly written originally, and then we need to rewrite it again to modernize it. That could be quite substantial, that could be quite small. We use this as also a way to bring in new developers. So there might be someone sitting on the fringe that says, it's only going to cost me €2,000 to just do this one particular thing, and if it's going to give them a little bit more money to live, obviously, so we just give them that. It's community voted though, so it's not like we just decide randomly who gets money. But bug fixing is part of that process. We actually allocate a budget for bug fixing, and all the core devs get communication to say, would you like to go into the bug fixing program for this round? And how much is your rate? And what bugs you want to fix? Here's how much our budget we've got to allocate, and you take it or you leave it. Part of that also helps us grow community as well. at least dev community, not so much user community, but this is kind of dev as well. It also helped us bring in new developers because we gave them 2 grant rounds, and eventually now they're doing more and more stuff because we gave them the leg up into the project without having to ask them to volunteer time they might not have had. Came back to an earlier slide about the friendly community, but welcoming new members is, being welcoming is one of the things we found we had over some of the other projects. It's definitely an experience that I had when I joined. The people who mentored me were very much more welcoming than some of the other communities. So it definitely helps if you're growing an open source community to be welcome-ish and not put people off. It also helps that we have quite a vast diversity in all different things. So in all the different areas, the more diversity you have in the project, the better, because there's nothing worse than just being centralized and not considering what other people might want. You'll see at this point, this is the contributors map. It's a little bit old because you'd think that people who do GIS for a living would be able to update their own location, but there's a few of these that are wrong. But if they were changed, they'd probably gravitate more that way. So it's probably not a good thing that it's changed, just leave it like that. But you can see there's quite a range spread out, even up in up Alaska, where Gary where Gary is. And you got a lot of focus around the European nations, but even there, like some of those people have moved into other places. So it helps to have that diversity so you can know that the problems that they face aren't the same problems that we face. GDA 2020, if you know about projection information, is a fun, in quotes, thing that we've had to deal with in Australia. It only really affects us and New Zealand. New Zealand have their own set of problems to deal with projections, but it only affects us. But then the work that we did for that will also help other nations because they have a similar problem, but no one's tackled it yet. So it helps to have that diversity of skills and users. So this is not a user map because there's a lot more users, but we just don't know where they are. But also being aware of other cultures. Now, this one, some crazy developer decided to put a Santa hat. I mean, the crazy developer was me, but I wasn't really conscious of how much impact that would have cross-culture, which I probably should have at the time, but I didn't. I was naive. And so putting that simple thing in the core and then rolling around to Christmas time, because I did it about June, July, so no one saw it. Obviously, the core devs saw it, but no one really raised an eyelid. Rolling around to Christmas time, all these people started getting Santa hats. It's great for people who don't care, but it's also not good for people who do care. And there are people who that has bad connotations for them. And so eventually we removed it quite quickly. But it's just being aware that there's people out there that don't have the same beliefs as you, so not trying to force too much culturalism through the application. A little bit's fine depending on the context, but forcing a Santa hat, it's not a good move. It might work for VLC, it doesn't work for us. Another cultural thing, and this is purely probably a more focused company culture thing, we used to call them hackfests. We used to have big developer meetings and sit around and talk and chill out, but they used to be called hackfests. That doesn't really fly well in sort of corporate-y environments. If you're saying I'm going to spend a week at a hackfest, they'd be like, why? You can call that internally if you like. I know companies that have hackfests internally, that's fine. But from a PR point of view, it doesn't sell well if you're trying to get money to go to a hackfest. It's like you're just sitting around wasting time. So if you're a core developer, you can attend, or even a user or even a plugin developer, you can attend the developer meetings now. They're a more focused event. It gives us something to focus on. It's just about naming. So it's a cultural thing, but it's about naming. That also helps us mentor and promote people into the core community. I was mentored and promoted up into a core dev, and I mentored and promoted people up into core devs as well. It helps to do that, to keep the community alive and have that diversity of skills. So the developer that I helped promote up far surpasses me in skill now. I just don't even try to compete. It's not worth it. So, but that also usually sort of comes from this. If you shame people for their stuff, the choice that they make, the development setup they've got, the operating system they run, you won't get them in your project as users or as developers. If you make them feel bad, they just won't join. So my operating system of choice is Windows, but this is a Linux laptop. So you don't want to shame users, this is bad. And that also has like developer user expectation kind of stuff. My expectation, I can run this laptop and install QGIS from source, no problem at all. It's easy for me, but for a user, that's not a thing that they can do. Like, it's just not something that they should have to do either. The community can fragment a little bit at times, purely more so because of the internet these days than it was back when it started. You'll see this back in the early slides. The user increase in the mailing list and then the user drop off in the mailing list. But this is also GIS Stack Exchange. If you're in the GIS space, it's like Stack Overflow, but for GIS people. That's the increase of QGIS related topics. It's not just core, it's like plugins and all sorts of stuff. The increase of topics on there versus the mailing list. So it's kind of a not 100% fair comparison, but they're all QGIS related stuff. So in some way it affects the project. You can see that there's Slack and IRC and GitHub and all those kinds of other places that all of the communication just fragments out. But you kind of don't have a choice. You've got to go where people are, and that's why I moved to GitHub and things like that. So I'll just run some quick final thoughts before we finish up. Use other projects heavily for inspiration. So Linux Foundation and the Pi setup, like the Python setup, we use that to inspire how we do the board and how we do the granting and all that kind of stuff. Also have to be willing to adopt, change your project, how your project works. If you're just stuck in a way, chances are you won't be able to go where the users are and do that kind of stuff. Community matters a lot more, probably more than the code does. The community was very good when I joined QGIS, and that helped me get better at the code and grow the community more. If the community was hostile, I probably just would have walked away. And support upstreams if you can. If you have the budget to support an upstream, it just helps everyone be better to support our upstreams. It makes us feel better, makes the whole ecosystem better. And then obviously support your project if you can have the capability of supporting a project that you like. If that's an upstream, then so be it, I guess. But that's about it. Yeah, that's fine.
Any questions?
Thanks for the talk. Just curious who your competitors would be.
So Esri and MapInfo are the two main GIS packages, right? Esri more so, because it's a similar kind of feel between the applications. But we don't directly go out to compete with them like we have to beat them all the time. That's not that. Like, we don't have salespeople and that kind of stuff. It's just if you're going to go to tender and pick a GIS solution for something, they will be there. MapInfo might be there, maybe not so much anymore, but QGIS is starting to take some of that market share a little bit. US is harder to break in, but Australia definitely, QGIS gets implemented into like local government where Esri used to be, or MapInfo used to be. So there's not really any other competitors in the proprietary space that have much market share that matters for that. Probably offended someone, but Esri the main one, yes.
What's the plugin ecosystem like with people? Can people make money out of plugins?
So the plugin...
Similar to like WordPress?
Yeah, so
the
plugin is, the project is GPL, I probably should mention that at the start. The project's GPL, so that carries all those licensing things with it. But people are still free to make money out of GPL plugins how they want. We have a plugin repository that we publish, but you can, QGIS supports like private repositories if you want to make your own in-house plugin repository and just share stuff internally. I've done that before at other workplaces where we just have a private one and a few internal tools that we use. People do make money out of it. I don't, because I don't have any plugins that are of any value except for a hats plugin. So download that. Plugin ecosystem, it's quite large, yeah. It's I don't know because I don't use any. Most of them are free, but there are people who probably do have paid ones, but they're probably internal, like consulting ones that they sell to clients or sell license fees to clients for access to other services. Like they might have a web service that they sell access to via the plugin. So there's a few plugins that probably hook to things like Google geocoding, and you have to pay for a license for that. Therefore, that's how you get money for the plugin kind of thing. So I just don't know. I don't use a lot of plugins because I'm more dev, less user these days.
Just a question in the context of my most immediate previous employer. probably within a year or conservatively 2 years would make the same income just selling maps, essentially, with analysis done by the people in the company using QGIS as your project's entire income for the year. What kind of, and they're not developers, they have no conception of what open source is and the work that goes behind that. Do you have recommendations for how that can be communicated better, or what would you ask them of them, given that it's become such a core part of their business?
As in people who want to make nice maps out of software for sale?
Yes, but it's a core part of their business, and they're earning a lot of money using the software, which for free. What's the best way of kind of communicating the work that's gone into that and how they can contribute, given they don't have developers or a natural kind of understanding of what the open source means?
Yeah, it's tricky. I did have someone ask that question of me a while ago on Slack about that kind of problem, where they're using it to make maps for a political party, and the political party does want to contribute, not really sure how. Most of the time, it's generally trying to direct people through that sponsorship process and keep the open source lovey-feely kind of thing away for a while, because people don't quite understand why it matters. They don't care, it's just a program. But through that sustaining members program, it's kind of a way. It's pretty cheap compared to a license, so you can sort of say, like, if you just become a sustaining member to make the project better or help it grow without having to confuse them with the open source model, basically, because some people don't care about the open source model. But if you say, like, if you pay $1,000 a year, it's like €1,000 a year for like the middle tier. It's not very much. You can get like your logo on the website and a couple other perks. It kind of gives the company a bit of a good feeling that they're doing something nice, but it's a communication issue, I guess. I'm not very good at communicating why you should do it. I just do it. So, yeah, not particularly helpful thoughts, unfortunately. Generally, I just direct people towards the sponsorship stuff if they're not sure how they contribute, and you think they've got money they can spend. That's how you go, because you could say either you spend money on licensing fees, or you get it for free, but maybe just throw some cash at us, basically.
But it's like, I think that'd be goodwill, because it's
Yeah.
such an important part of the business.
Yeah, and part of the website is we get a list of donation, like if you donate, you get your name on there. That can be company name or private name. If you're a sustaining member, you get logo and all kinds of other fluff with it. But trying to find the right level to do, and terminology depends on the company. If they don't like donating, but they'll be a sustaining member because it gives them a little certificate and things like that. So it's a hard one, unfortunately.
I think
so you alluded a bit to the troubles with bug fixing and volunteers. Maybe can you elaborate a bit more on like how you handle conflicts and interest conflicts between the people who decide who gets the money and the people who get the money?
Yeah, there's a selection committee. It usually comes down to trust for a start. There's certain developers in the community that are trusted in terms of deliver good results on good time with good money. So they tend to get first pick if we know that if we're gonna do a bug fixing round and they propose they're going to fix 20 bugs, chances are they're probably going to fix those 20 bugs. And if it's going to cost us €5,000, I'm just making that up, I don't know how much it costs, we're probably more willing to spend it on them than someone new. So you kind of have to work up the ranks. You won't just get money. We won't just give you $5,000 to fix stuff if we've never seen you before. It's kind of that issue of we have to trust that someone can actually deliver the results first. I don't really know the internals of that bug fixing program super well because I've never actually participated in it. As a core dev, we get first pick ongoing as part of that program. Like I get an email every release saying we're going to bug fix, but I don't participate in it because I've got a job that doesn't require me to participate. But there's a whole selection process, and it comes down to what money we can allocate, what bugs are priorities, and giving a fair share out to the core developers who show good results generally. So it's not kind of the same, maybe not the answer that you're looking for, but I can get you a contact if you want to know how it works internally from a finance point of view and a contract point of view. But it's done as an official project that we run every release. So it's well known that we do it, basically.
I think that's time up for now, but I'm sure Nathan will be available outside for further questions.
I'll be around.
So here's a little spoken from the
Thanks.
organisers.